Chapter 11, The Rising of Atlantis. May I now be permitted in this final chapter of Part 1 to give my own feelings about these messages and their relation to the world. We are now approaching a period in the history of the world when great natural changes are taking place. Countries that have been free from earthquakes and terrestrial disturbances for thousands of years are again experiencing them. In 1935, it was reported in the Daily Telegraph that Poland had suffered a severe quake causing damage to property. The report went on to say that this was the first earthquake reported in that region within living memory. This change in the earthquake belt is caused by the shifting of the Earth's axis due to the precession of the equinoxes. A complete precess takes approximately 25,000 years, and each section of the complete precession takes roughly 2,083 years. We are at the present time 170 years into the age of Aquarius, the end of which will complete a 25,000-year solar cycle. It came into being about the year 1785 AD, and one of the great features of this age is the emancipation of woman. She made her first inroads into Freemasonry in France just prior to the Revolution, when high personages such as the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchess de Chartres instituted women's lodges. Up to this time, man had ruled supreme and woman was merely a chattel to do the housekeeping and produce children for the coming generation. This changed when the Revolution of 1792 broke out. Women enrolled in the fighting forces of the French army and helped to keep out the invader. As the years have progressed, women have encroached more and more on the ground which man had called his own in spite of opposition. Today there is no field in which women has not competed. She has won fame in the air, on land and sea, and in the world of sport she is capable of indulging in almost all that has hitherto been man's prerogative. Another aspect of this Aquarian age is the unrest among the masses of the great nations. Revolutions have tottered many thrones, and this process, with notable exceptions, has gone on ever since the French Revolution. It seems as if the people have awakened from their apathy and have discovered that their rulers have been ruling for their own benefit instead of for the masses under their charge. They have discovered all the vile and beastly intrigues that go on within the ruling circles of the world, and they are angry to think that for so long have they been blind to it all, thus suffering much that could have been avoided. A warning is given in the teachings of Osiris when we read, "Many are the trials which man doth call upon himself, many are the trials with which the world shall be beset. The days are at hand when nation shall rise against nation and class against class." Since this message, there has been all manner of unrest in the world. There was the Spanish Revolution and its attendant horrors, the French riots of 1932, when communist activity caused much damage to property and life. Then, most important of all, the attack by Russia on Finland and the aggressions by Hitler against Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, which touched off the powder keg and launched World War II. At the moment of writing, communist aggression is going on all over the world. Today, the tendency is for the masses to revolt against all authority. Sons of aristocrats fraternize with the sons of the people and give their wealth to the cause of democracy. There are yet other signs which have ushered in the Aquarian age. The world weather is upset. This is due in part to the precession of the equinoxes caused by the shifting of the Earth's axis, which can be likened to a huge dynamo shifting its polarity. Tremendous storms and cyclones are sweeping the continents, and the biggest Atlantic liners are being held up, having to heave to, finding it impossible to continue upon their way. Sporadic earthquakes are taking place all over the world, whilst hitherto extinct volcanoes are bursting into new life. During the last few years, Turkey has had a succession of bad earthquakes, as have also many Pacific islands. During the last few years, the United States of America has been getting much harder winters, also abnormally hot summers, sending the mercury up to 105. New York has experienced terrific cold, which has seen the mercury considerably below zero. The Gulf Stream, upon which our climate relies so absolutely, is becoming altered on an account of the changing conditions on the bed of the Atlantic Ocean. On page 50, we read the Lament of Horace. This prophecy, written down in 1926, will be fulfilled, and we are being afforded the first signs of this. The bed of the Atlantic is rising steadily, and eventually we shall be able to explore the sunken continent of Atlantis when it pushes up through the swirling waters. As it brought death to men when it sank below the sea, so it will bring death to the submarine life of the ocean when it again reappears. We can imagine its cities overgrown with seaweed and various ocean plants, with octopi and many strange creatures clinging to the columns of its temples and palaces. The reappearance of this long-lost continent will take place any time within the next 50 years, so as far can be judged. There are other authorities who arrive at the same conclusions and who base their prophecies on archaeological and astronomical calculations. Footnote 1. See World Predictions by Kiro. Also, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Donnelly, and The History of Atlantis by Lewis Spence. I mention this because it is interesting to find similar predictions and deductions from sources totally ignorant of each other. The actual time of the rising of Atlantis will more or less coincide with the latter day period of social chaos and war called Armageddon, and I am told that international affairs are already working towards that upheaval. Let us quote two important passages in the Bible which point to this. One is in Revelation XVI, verse 16 to 20. 16. And he gathered them together unto a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. 17. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, It is done. 18. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. 19. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. 20. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Now let us see what Ezekiel has to say about the coming climax to modern civilization and of the great war of wars, which is identifiable with the Armageddon of Revelation. If we read chapter XXXVIII, we shall find it written thus, And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, and I will return thee back and put hooks in thy jaws. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, and a great company and a mighty army. And thou shalt come up against my people Israel, as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. And it shall come to pass at the same time that my fury shall come up in my face. Surely in that day shall there be a great shaking in the land of Israel. Footnote 1. The real translation should be the lands of Israel. Israel does not mean the Jews only, who were merely 2.5 tribes of the whole 12 tribes of Israel. The Jews did not form themselves into a separate nation until some 250 years after Jesus. And the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, and I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood. And I will rain upon him, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, and overflowing rain, and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. It seems quite evident that the biblical language is endeavoring to predict that in the latter days of this 25,000-year cycle, a calamity shall come to the earth and its sons, which shall be of two kinds. Firstly, the hosts of Gog shall come out of the north parts and shall endeavor to subdue the nations who control the non-communist world or land. That they will come in great numbers is indicated by the sentence, as a cloud to cover the land. We are further told in Ezekiel 38 that Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya shall come with them as allies. Footnote 2. Modern Abyssinia. This prophecy seems to suggest that Gog, whom the Assyrian writings identify with Russia, will be successful at first, but that natural laws will overcome him. This brings us to the second part of the calamity. The prophecy says, "My fury shall come up in my face," meaning that natural laws will at the same time be affecting the earth, causing great storms and earthquakes, which will hinder the combatant armies, but more so the hosts of Gog, presumably because of their strategical position. Great earthquakes are also indicated by the fact that the prophecy continues by saying that mountains shall be thrown down and all steep places fall. There is a parallel in Revelation where it says, "And every island fled away, and the mountains were no more found." Translation and retranslation have made it difficult to understand and give these prophecies their full interpretations. But there is no doubt that the quotations I have given from Revelation and from Ezekiel are both referring to the same thing. If we look around us, we must realize that although peace is being sought so strenuously, the tension and distrust existing between the communist and anti-communist nations is such that any false move by either side could cause the cauldron to bubble over into open conflict. Soviet Russia is controlling the governments of the smaller nations and forcing alliances, not for the good of those nations, but for the good of themselves. Footnote 1. Since this was written in 1954, China has come to the fore as another great communist power that challenges the modern Russian interpretation of communism, which in the last few years has moved towards the idea of peaceful coexistence. These communists are individually distrustful of one another and, even within their own vicious circle, dare not be frank and speak their minds fully. The entire fabric of the civilized world is becoming brittle and will crumble just as did that of Atlantis, for within the anti-communist nations also there is a fatal greed and desire to control world finance and world resources for individual gain. Those responsible hold high places in the governments of these nations. Let them be aware of the golden calf lest it destroy them. The people of Atlantis became avaricious and graft open the door to position and wealth. Morals became degraded to such an extent that they hardly existed. The same applies today, the latter days of this 25,000-year cycle. The barrier that should exist between the sexes has almost entirely disappeared, with the result that familiarity has bred contempt. And today there is a fatal disease gradually being cultivated within the structure of social life, and that of perverted sex. It is spreading and spreading chiefly because human nature is lacking purpose. Sin, after all, is only the result of lack of purpose. A perverted sexual urge is failure to interpret the natural power to create given us by God, and if permitted to thrive will undermine the social structure. The individual sins or commits errors because he fails to understand the necessity of applying his knowledge rightly. He finds it more entertaining to experiment with that knowledge, quite ignorant of the fact that every natural law transgressed or wrongly applied must have its effect upon the wrongdoer. Thus it is with human nature, and perhaps if we realized fully that our deeds find us out, we should give more attention to the following quotation. I will visit the sins of the fathers upon the children, even unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and show mercy unto thousands of them that love me. Our only sin is the sin of failure to appreciate the benefits to be gained by carrying out the laws of nature and as accurately as possible. This applies to every phase of life. A child is born to sorrow because of the sins of his forebears, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare them children. The child is born sinless, except for the sins of others, yet always willing to embrace sin so soon as the dreadful cloak of human nature overcomes the spiritual. Mortal perception is limited and is like a man standing in a thick fog and not knowing which way to go. It sees only that which is immediately surrounding it and is mostly completely ignorant of those larger vistas of life which exist in the realms of spirit. Human nature lacks balance, aspiring either entirely to the spiritual and courting failure, or descending entirely to the pleasures and desires of the mortal, when it also retards its evolutionary progress as an individual by accumulating inhibited errors which have to be worked out in further incarnate experiences. What we have to do is to strive to keep the balance between the spiritual and the material. We must bridge the gap which exists between the two opposites, so that we can attain a knowledge of how to control the natural laws for the common good, and not merely for the sake of self and its possible benefit to ourselves. Until human nature can eradicate self and can visualize things from a universal standpoint, there will be neither peace nor security for it. It is impossible for man to achieve justice until he can do this, because all his actions are prompted by his hereditary selfish instincts. Individually and collectively we talk of self-preservation, but we always fail to finish this human slogan. It should be self-preservation at any cost. During the two great wars, justice and honesty were unknown, and as they were fought on such a foundation, we cannot expect to reap other than that which is our just reward, represented by the further chaos into which the world is drifting. Nature is always just, and our harvest is commensurate with what we have sown. During these wars, all manner of slogans were used to inflame the youth of the nations to slaughter each other. It mattered not whether they were true or not, they served their purpose at the time. During World War II, the non-communist world entered into alliances with communist countries such as Russia, and today we have the unpleasant picture of the anti-Christian communist state. During World War II, the non-communist world entered into alliances with communist countries such as Russia, and today we have the unpleasant picture of the anti-Christian communist states levying a Cold War upon their one-time allies in an endeavor to smash them financially. The drain of the rearmament to the allied nations is astronomical, but they must go on because if ever Russia gets a definite military lead, she will risk war to obtain world domination. We are watching a gigantic battle for the soul of our planet, and the legions of Satan are what are arrayed against us. I have endeavored to write this book without any bias in any direction, and I am therefore adhering very rigidly to information that has been given to me in the process of my writings. All my statements are taken from the Osirian scripts, although in this final chapter I have been obliged to reconstruct and fit together much of this information that is contained within the writings. That it is objectively true, men of standing can come forward and prove. As to the final proofs, I can only say that time must be the eventual judge, but as many of the prophecies contained within the 3 volumes of Osiris have already been proved, I think that it is only reasonable to assume that these final proofs will be forthcoming. During the last 20 years, more and more discoveries have been made in Egypt at the Sphinx and pyramids. These excavations have revealed underground subways connecting the Great and Second Pyramid areas. That is another step towards proving that the pyramids of Giza were connected and followed a carefully thought out plan and were not originally built at the burial places of the pharaohs. Professor Salim Hassan found some chambers in the vicinity of the Great Pyramid which are a considerable depth below the surface. He admitted that he was bewildered, for he said in the Daily Telegraph of the 4th of March 1935, "This quest of a burial place so far below the old burial ground is most unusual and recalls the now historic tomb of Hetepheres. As yet this Masonic city has to be fully discovered." In the Sunday Express of the 7th of July 1935, it is stated in a leading article that a marvelously laid out city had been discovered having perfect drainage and other amenities which were not introduced into Europe until 200 years ago. Those in charge of the excavations near the Great Pyramid state that the city they are unearthing is the most beautifully planned they have ever seen. This bears out the words of the Osirian scripts when it is stated that the Atlanteans and their descendants, the early Egyptians, had many things which have not yet been thought of in modern civilization. To quote further from the Sunday Express of the 7th of July, it says, "Probably the most important discovery is a stone pulley wheel found near the city. This tends to show that ancient Egypt knew more of building methods than modern generations suspect. As I write, excavations are being carried out at Saqqara in the desert about 15 miles west of Cairo. Professor W. B. Emery is in charge. I will quote as follows from the Illustrated London News of the 23rd of May, 1953. This tomb, that of Pharaoh Uwajji, is, however, of the greatest interest in the light that it throws on the dynastic race, the rulers of Egypt in the 4th millennium BC and the founders of the pharaonic civilization. Concerning the enigma of this civilization, one of the great wonders of the world, Professor Emery had elsewhere posed the query: was it the outcome of a sudden step forward in the pre-dynastic cultures of the indigenes, or was it due to a different race whose arrival changed the whole cultural trend of the Nile Valley some 5,000 years ago? And it is most likely in the tombs of Saqqara that the answer is to be found. Now this is very interesting coming from the pen of an authority like Professor Emery. My teacher tells me that, in fact, the answer will be found in the pyramid areas of Lower Egypt, particularly at Giza and Saqqara, the race who came and settled in the Nile Delta were the emigrants from Atlantis referred to earlier in this book in chapters 4 through 6. And it was their culture which led up to and was the forerunner of the dynastic race of pharaohs. The fact that the royal daughter of the pharaoh chose which of her brothers should marry her and rule Egypt in her name as pharaoh was also handed down from these Atlantean emigrants, and was the result of a memory being carried down from the early Atlanteans when they were actually born twin affinities. All myths have their being in original fact, as do also the so-called mythical divine mysteries of Egypt. These so-called god pharaohs were actually incarnate Adamic sons of Ptah, who had been born on earth to be teachers of the people, and the large pyramids of Egypt are the Masonic initiation centers erected by them for carrying out the government of the people under their charge. Parallel situations exist in Central and South America, where the Aztec and Inca civilizations are landmarks left by the emigrants from Atlantis, whose fleets of boats carried them to the shores of the Western Hemisphere. A calamity such as destroyed Atlantis happening today would almost certainly plunge the world into a state of social chaos, and time went on, and a new civilization grew from the embers of the old, give rise to fables and myths, which would be handed down ascribing to the great men of our historical period exaggerated powers. So we can see how the rulers of the antediluvian world were likewise deified by the descendants of those who escaped the deluge to found new civilizations. Appendix. Since completing this book, world events have Appendix. Since completing this book, world events have made it essential that I draw attention to the chaos into which mankind is drifting. My master Onoferu tells me that the first clouds of the approaching cataclysm to modern civilizations are already topping the horizon, and unless there is a halt to materialism, will destroy mankind. The deterioration set in rapidly with the advent of the dictators of the world. The action of dictator Mussolini of Italy in Abyssinia prior to World War II awakened something in the black races which will not easily be stamped out. Then Stalin and Hitler, not forgetting General Franco, still in power in Spain, added their major aggressions to social world chaos. All these things took place because of their lust for power, also the avarice and distrust existing among the rulers of the nations. Confusion will become worse, confounded before man again finds himself and calls a halt to his present headlong rush into materialism. Then the churches, what of their attitude through all of this? The Orthodox Christian world has always considered itself the only true authority on God and has hitherto looked upon all of their beliefs as pagan. Jesus said, I come not to bring peace into the world, but a sword. Can the modern Christian ecclesiastics give a true interpretation of this saying of Jesus? My master says that even if they could, they would not, chiefly because its true interpretation would not be pleasing to their august ears. It is, however, as follows. Jesus knew that eventually so-called Christianity would become a state or political religion. He knew further that it would split into scores and scores of sects, creeds, dogmas, all of which would be at war with each other. He knew that in crises such as the Italo-Abyssinian dispute and the two great world wars, the so-called Christian leaders would individually exhort their particular nations to slaughter each other by declaring that God was fighting expressly for them. The Pope, footnote 1, Pope Pius XII, for instance, looked with favor upon Mussolini's disastrous Ethiopian campaign, and, as was to be expected, the followers of that ecclesiastic imagined that God had really condoned and, in fact, authorized another war, this time for the express advantage of Italy. Happily, the God consciousness is reawakening in many breasts. Happily, the God consciousness is reawakening in many breasts, and the twilight of these ecclesiastics and political usurpers is gradually falling. Chaos has steadily grown and flared to world dimensions with the advent of World War II. The injustices and false propaganda made use of, together with the uneasy alliances of anti-communist nations with communist nations, could not breed anything but further chaos and confusion. This is in fact what has happened, and today complete political banditry exists and promises are given simply to suit the moment and to get as much advantage as possible over an opponent. The cataclysm which finally engulfed Lemuria about 30,000 BC destroyed all human life on that continent. The only remnants of the human race who survived being those who read the signs of the times and migrated to unknown lands when the first terrestrial upheavals started. Some moved in a westerly direction, acting upon an inherent cosmic urge until they finally came to the continent of Africa and the isles of the West. In other words, Atlantis and the many islands then existing in the western Atlantic. So we now see that the Lemurian deluge took place at the latter end of the 25,000 year cycle, immediately preceding our own, and some 15,000 years before the destruction of Atlantis, which took place about 15,000 BC. We are almost at the end of our own 25,000 year cycle, there being only 1,902 years left to complete it. Thus it will be seen that today we live in that period called the latter days by the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 38, where he prophesies a world cataclysm consisting of war as well as great storms and earthquakes. The full quotation is given in chapter 11 of this volume. The Earth's polarity is shifting so that great upheavals may be expected to take place throughout the world, being especially violent between latitudes 50 north and 20 south. Isaiah chapter 19 verse 19 to 20 says, "In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord." A pillar at the border thereof, in this quotation, refers to the great Masonic center of Giza. In these latter days, the secrets of the Masonic temple beneath the Great Pyramid will be rediscovered, when it will be seen how the ancient rulers of the earth during Egypt's childhood, of which modern archaeology knows little or nothing, had to qualify for rulership through initiations in these Masonic schools. The remains of many of these temples have been discovered in Egypt, North, Central, and South America, as well as in many other places. The twilight of the false rulers and priests, who have held the reins of power and misused it for so long, is creeping on and will eventually swallow them up in the night of destruction, so that there may be in the literal sense a new heaven and a new earth. Man will again be taught to seek God within himself and will make his own new mental heaven within his own soul. Mankind will be ruled and guided according to the laws that have been handed down from the ancient initiates, and which will be rediscovered within the heart of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Only the pure in heart can know them, because the knowledge of natural laws contained within that great Masonic temple cannot be entrusted to those who cherish worldly power and desires above all else. Imagine these enormous potentials falling into the hands of a man of the caliber of General Perón, dictator of the Argentine at the time of going to print, who, having ruthlessly purged all opposition, aspires to keep himself in power by playing upon the hysteria of the ignorant masses, by raising what he thinks will be a lasting memorial to his wife's memory, a memory surrounded by graft and all those things that go to make up the modern demagogue. But the days of the Hitlers, the Mussolinis, the Stalins, the Francos, and the Peróns are passing. They have dug their own graves and will sink down into the ignominy they deserve. The spirit of individualism is abroad, and mankind is seeking to know the truths underlying God's creation. He is sensing those wider vistas of freedom which are his birthright from the Creator. He is realizing that he is a part of the whole, and as such is an important cog in the great cosmic machine, and that his pathway lies in endeavoring to create better conditions for himself and his fellow men, instead of being a slave to state monopolies which never benefit anybody except those at the helm, who suppress all criticism and opposition by the most ruthless methods, secret police, political commissars, and so on. They are the modern Herods, and like Herod, kill all opposition, full knowing that somewhere within the robot states are the modern counterparts of Jesus, men who are carrying the ancient cosmic knowledge, which will blast their synthetic kingdoms and eventually, through all adversities, trials, and tribulations, lead mankind back to the full realization of his divine origin and potentialities. The road is long and stony, but the ultimate prize to be won is great above all things, and it is the duty of all who have this inner knowledge to teach it and spread it, so that the earth may again become a place worthy of the trust God has placed in it, and in the ability of its sons to win the fight against the incarnate forces of evil materialism. We are now in the so-called atomic age, and this newfound knowledge can either destroy present-day world civilization and plunge it back into a period of darkness and social chaos, or if used for the benefit and good of mankind, can prove a victory and the greatest boon for humanity. The scales are loaded and we must await the result, using all our efforts towards the consummation of God's plan, wherever and whenever we can. The question has often been put to me, are the calamities spoken of unavoidable, and if so, what is the use of trying to put things right? My answer is that man has free will and it is up to him to learn to use it in the right direction. It may be that he will yet bring misfortunes upon himself before he fully realizes that the matter is in his own hands, and that only by cooperation with nature and its laws will he avoid the impending calamity to humanity spoken of by the prophets and reiterated in the Osirian scripts.